The night was still when the knock came, a sound too soft to match the weight it carried. On her doorstep stood a man with dust in his hair and a newborn wrapped tight against his chest. "They'll take her if you don't," he said, voice breaking. "She's got no one." What began as a widow's act of mercy would test the law, stir the gossip of neighbors, and force an outlaw to choose between running from justice or standing to claim a family he never thought he deserved, and, by the end, a secret buried in a brand new book would change everything the frontier thought it knew about him. The wind carried no mercy that night. It slipped under the warped boards of the widow's cabin, rattled the lantern glass, and pressed cold fingers into her bones. Martha Keene had learned to live with such intrusions. The plains did not. Coddle women who remained after burying husbands, and the storm outside was only another reminder that winter had no patience for the weak. She had just banked the fire when the knock came. A sharp, deliberate sound. Not the friendly rap of a neighbor, not the desperate pounding of someone lost in the dark. This was different, measured, like a man bracing himself before crossing a line. She froze, hand still resting on the iron poker. Few called on her after sundown. Fewer still carried the weight she heard in that knock. Slowly, she lifted the latch. On the threshold stood a man cloaked in dust and shadows. His hat brim dripped with melted snow, his coat torn at the sleeve. But it wasn't his condition that stole her breath. It was what he cradled. A child. No bigger than a loaf of bread, swaddled in a threadbare blanket. "She's got no one," the man said. His voice cracked like a brittle fence post, but his eyes held steady. "Take her. Feed her, please." Martha's throat tightened. The baby stirred, a faint whimper against the storm. Milk-starved by the sound. She reached before she could think better, pulling the bundle close. Tiny fingers brushed against her collar, featherlight, desperate. "Who are you?" she asked. He hesitated. That pause spoke louder than any name. His jaw tightened, and when he finally spoke, it was with the weight of someone already condemned. "Doesn't matter. Only matters that she lives." Martha looked him over. The leather holster at his hip was empty, but the imprint of a gun still marked the shape. The outlaw stories whispered in town always began with such details. Ragged men, storm-beaten, carrying burdens that didn't belong to them. "You'll not just leave her on my stoop," she said firmly. "Come in." For a long moment he seemed to debate whether he belonged inside anyone's door. Then, with a sigh that sounded like surrender, he stepped across the threshold. The cabin swallowed them whole. The crackle of the fire, the smell of rabbit stew simmering, the hush of wind against the chinked logs. It all pressed in. Martha laid the baby on her quilted bed and lit a lamp to see her properly. Pale cheeks, lips trembling with cold. A girl. By the look, she'll need feeding, Martha murmured, half to herself. The outlaw hovered by the door, hat in his hands. The storm framed him in shifting flakes, as though the night still fought to claim him. "I'm not here to stay," he said. "Posse's riding, and they'll come this way soon enough." "Then why bring her?" Martha asked. He blinked, as though surprised she dared the question. "Because running's easier when you ain't gotta hear a baby cry." Her jaw set. "And what kind of man abandons a child to strangers?" His gaze flickered. Shame, shadowing the hard lines of his face. For a heartbeat, he looked less like an outlaw and more like a boy caught stealing bread. One that's run out of choices. The baby cried again, thin, frantic. Martha scooped her up, rocking gently. Her husband had passed near 2 winters ago, before they could start a family. The ache of that loss never left her, but in the fragile weight of this child, she felt a strange, aching echo. The man moved closer, unthinking, until the firelight touched his features. High cheekbones, sun-browned skin, eyes hollow from miles ridden without rest. Not the face of a marauder, more like a man hunted down. "You'll not make it far in this weather," she said softly. "I've made it farther, but not with them on your trail." He didn't answer. At dawn, the first sign of pursuit arrived. A rider passed on the ridge above, pausing only long enough to study the valley before pressing on. The outlaw stiffened, hand twitching toward the absent gun. "They'll come here," he muttered. Martha stood, still cradling the baby. "Then they'll find a widow feeding an orphan. That's no crime." His eyes met hers, dark, searching, as if he wanted to believe her courage could be enough for them both. But courage didn't stop bullets. By noon, word had spread. Thomas Avery, the rancher from the next homestead, arrived with supplies. He filled the doorway with his broad shoulders and steady presence. His eyes went first to Martha, then to the child, then to the stranger standing stiff in the shadows. "You'll need more than stew if you mean to keep her fed," Thomas said, setting down a jug of goat's milk. His voice was calm, but his gaze never left the outlaw. "Neighbor," Martha said quickly, "this man brought her to me. He means her no harm." Thomas raised a brow. "Is that so?" The outlaw straightened, chin high. "The girl's innocent. That's all that matters." For a moment the room held its breath. The crackle of fire, the faint coo of the baby, the muffled howl of wind, all seemed to wait on Thomas's judgment. At last, he gave a slow nod. "Then we'll see she's cared for, both of you. But if trouble comes," the outlaw cut in, voice hard. "It always does." Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie blanketed in white so clean it hurt the eyes. Smoke curled thinly from the widow's chimney, a lone signal against a sky washed pale. Inside, life had narrowed to 3 souls and a child, held together by nothing more than necessity and the fragile thread of mercy. Martha moved with quiet efficiency, feeding the baby with warmed milk from Thomas's jug, humming an old hymn as if the tune alone might coax strength into the tiny body. The outlaw, still refusing to give a name, hovered in the corner, restless. His boots scuffed the plank floor, hands twitching as though every moment indoors frayed his nerves. "You'll wear a hole if you keep pacing," Martha said without looking up. He stopped, jaw tightening. "I don't sit well when men might. Be riding my trail." "Then sit for her sake," she countered, nodding toward the baby. "Your fretting stirs her more than the wind." For the first time, he obeyed. He lowered himself onto the stool, posture stiff, but his eyes softened. As the baby's tiny lips latched to the bottle, a sound escaped him, half sigh, half something deeper. "She quiets easily with you," he murmured. "Children know when they're safe," Martha replied. Then, softer, "Question is, do you?" He didn't answer. By mid-morning, Thomas returned. His arrival was less a surprise now and more relief, the steady presence of a man who had weathered enough winters to know when neighbors needed watching. He brought a sack of flour and fresh kindling, placing them without ceremony near the hearth. "You'll need more stores if this snow holds," Thomas said. His gaze swept the cabin, landing last on the outlaw. "And you'll need to decide." "How long you're keeping company?" the outlaw bristled. "Not long. Once the trail cools, I'll move on." "Trail won't cool with a posse sniffing through these hills," Thomas said flatly. "And folks talk. Already saw smoke from your chimney when I rode into town. Won't take long before someone asks who's sharing it." Martha felt the sting of that truth. Widowhood carried its own suspicions, but a man lingering under her roof, an unnamed man at that, would feed every wagging tongue from here to Dry Creek. Still, she squared her shoulders. "Let them talk. I won't turn out a child. Or the one who saved her." The outlaw's head snapped toward her, surprise plain in his expression. He opened his mouth, then shut it, as though no answer could match the weight of her words. That afternoon, chores brought them into a rhythm. Martha tended the baby, Thomas hauled wood, and the outlaw split logs with quick, efficient strokes that spoke of a man used to labor. He worked until sweat streaked through the dust on his face, as if punishing himself with each swing of the axe. Martha watched from the window, baby against her shoulder. He had the look of someone accustomed to proving worth with muscle alone, a man who'd never been offered belonging without cost. When evening came, they shared stew at the table. The outlaw ate little, speaking less. Only when the baby gurgled from her cradle did he allow himself the faintest smile, brief as a shooting. "Star. She ought to have a name," Martha said. The outlaw stiffened. "That's not mine to give." "Then it falls to whoever holds her now," Martha replied firmly. She studied the child's small face, then said, "Clara. She looks like Clara." Thomas nodded in approval. "Strong name." The outlaw swallowed. Hard, as though the sound itself branded him. "Clara," he repeated, voice hushed. But outside those walls, suspicion grew. 2 riders passed along the lower trail the next morning, reining in long enough to peer toward the cabin before moving. On, Martha caught the flicker of metal on a saddle, rifles carried for more than hunting. By noon, a neighbor woman arrived with a basket of bread. Her eyes roved over the outlaw like a hawk measuring prey, and though her lips smiled, her words dripped. "With warning, not safe for a woman alone to keep strange company," she said. "Folks might think he's taking advantage." Martha kept her chin high. "And folks might remember the good book commands us to shelter the needy." The woman's smile tightened. "Needy's one thing, hunted's another." When she left, the air in the cabin grew heavy. The outlaw stared into the fire. "You shouldn't pay the price for me." Martha shook her head. "A child doesn't choose the arms that carry her. And neither did you, it seems." He met her gaze then, something raw flickering in his eyes, fear, gratitude, shame, all knotted together. Outside, the snow fell again. Inside, fragile trust began to take root. The quiet broke before the sun did. A gunshot cracked in the distance, thin and sharp as ice splitting on the river. Martha flinched, clutching Clara closer. Thomas was already at the door, scanning the white ridgeline. Nothing moved but crows lifting from a cottonwood. "It's warning enough," Thomas muttered. "They know he's here." The outlaw stood from the hearth, shoulders tight. He hadn't given his name yet, but danger had a way of naming men without consent. His every motion whispered outlaw, whether it was true or not. "They'll circle. First," he said grimly. "Make you feel hemmed before they close the pen." Martha steadied her voice. "And what do you call it, when you bring a child to safety and face men with rifles for it? That's no outlaw's work." His jaw clenched, as though her words hurt worse than the guns. By midday, the first knock came. Not the desperate plea of that stormy night, but a loud, official pounding. Sheriff Calhoun stood on the step, coat buttoned tight, badge glinting in the brittle sun. 2 deputies flanked him, rifles shouldered like props at a stage. "Mornin', Mrs. Keene," the sheriff drawled. His eyes slid past her shoulder into the room. "Word is you've taken on boarders." "Word travels faster than truth," Martha said evenly. The sheriff tilted his head, boots creaking on her porch. "Funny thing about truth, it's often written down, like in my warrants, and I've got one here for a man answering the look of yours." Behind her, the outlaw shifted, hand brushing instinctively toward his empty holster. Thomas caught the motion, stepped squarely in front of him, broad enough to block the view. "This cabin holds a widow and a babe," Thomas said flatly. "Nothing in your warrant about that." The sheriff smirked. "Babe wasn't mentioned in the reports." "True. Maybe that's because she ain't his." Martha's grip on Clara tightened. "She's mine to keep now," she said firmly. "No paper can tell me otherwise." Calhoun's gaze lingered on her, hard as frost. Then he tipped his hat. Mind. Yourself, ma'am. Storms break cabins easier than the weather does. And with that, he turned his horse and rode off, deputies trailing. The cabin air felt smaller after they left. The outlaw leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. They'll come back, he said hoarsely, and each time closer. Thomas looked at him, eyes narrowed. What's the truth of it? Did you run because you're guilty, or because you never had enough coins to prove you ain't? For the first time, the outlaw spoke more than a handful of words. His voice was rough but steady. I was a ranch hand, worked Brander's spread north of Silver Hollow. Cattle went missing. Foreman swore it was me. The sheriff took his word. No trial worth calling one. Just a noose waiting if I stuck around. So I ran. Silence fell. Martha studied his face in the firelight. Tired, hollowed, but not the face of a thief. Clara fussed, and he stepped closer, almost shyly, to soothe her. The baby quieted at once. A man guilty doesn't calm a child like that, Martha whispered. The outlaw looked at her as though the words themselves were a mercy he'd never been granted. But mercy couldn't hold back a town's hunger for spectacle. The next day, riders lingered at the edge of the clearing. Neighbors who once nodded politely now whispered as Martha passed with Clara in her shawl. One spat in the snow as she walked by, muttering about women keeping wolves as pets. When Thomas carried word back that the saloon had taken to laying bets on how long the outlaw would last, Martha's hands trembled so hard she nearly spilled Clara's milk. They treat this like sport, she hissed. Thomas's jaw hardened. Then we'll remind them this is flesh and blood, and we'll stand until he can't be called wolf no more. That night, the outlaw mended a broken hinge on the barn door. Martha brought a lantern, watching him work. His hands were sure, practiced, the kind of hands that built rather than broke. You fix things like you've lived fixing, she said. He gave a humorless smile. When you're poor, you either mend or you lose. She hesitated, then asked, the question she had carried since the knock at her door. Why her? Why bring the babe to me? The outlaw froze, hammer poised in the air. Slowly, he lowered it. Her mother died birthing her, he said quietly. I found her wrapped up, alone. She didn't ask for the blood in her story. I couldn't leave her. The lantern flame trembled, shadows dancing across the snow. Martha's throat tightened. You may be hunted, she said, voice firm. But in my eyes, you are not lost. His breath caught, ragged. For a moment, the outlaw, nameless, accused, framed, looked like a man tasting grace for the first time. The snow carried secrets no fire could melt. Days bled into one another, measured by the baby's cries and the wary rhythm of three adults bound by circumstance. Martha mended clothes, Thomas cut fresh wood, and the outlaw, still nameless, kept himself busy with the small repairs no one asked him to do. Hinges tightened, fences straightened, leaks patched. It was strange, Martha thought, how quickly a man could slip into the shape of home without ever meaning to. Yet the air was thick with what went unsaid. His presence in her cabin was like a thundercloud, heavy, charged, waiting to break. That evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, Thomas set down his mug of coffee and said what Martha had long feared he might. If you're staying here another night, you'll need to be known by more than your shadow. The outlaw's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked to Martha, then back to Thomas. Name's Eli, he said finally, the word tasting like confession. Eli Ryder. The syllables hung in the air. Thomas gave a single nod, but Martha caught the tension in his jaw, the silent calculation of a man weighing truth against danger. You were a ranch hand up north, Thomas said. I heard the talk. Branders swore you stole stock. Eli's gaze dropped to the fire. Talk's easier than proof. Foreman wanted me gone, and the sheriff's pocket was already lined. His voice hardened. I carried nothing from that spread but calluses. Martha spoke softly. And the child? Silence stretched before Eli answered. Her mother worked. The cookhouse, he said, voice low. Young. Too young to be birthing in winter without help. She begged me, when the pains came, to fetch the midwife. I rode, but the storm was faster. By the time I returned, he swallowed hard, the words cutting deeper than any blade. Only the baby lived. She clutched my finger like she meant to tether me. I couldn't let her die either. Martha's throat tightened. She looked at Clara, sleeping warm against her quilt, her tiny breath rising steadily. You carried her here through the storm, she whispered. Eli nodded once. And I'll carry her farther if I must, even if it costs me. My neck. The room was silent but for the fire. Martha studied him in the flicker of light, seeing past the outlaw's rags to the man beneath. A man who had chosen mercy when he could have chosen flight. Thomas leaned back, eyes steady. That kind of choice makes a man worth standing beside, but it also paints a target on anyone near him. Eli met his gaze squarely. I won't ask you to bear that. You don't have to ask, Thomas said simply. Neighbors stand when trouble rides in. The words landed with the weight of an oath. For the first time, Eli's shoulders eased. Later, when Thomas had gone to tend his stock, Martha lingered near the hearth, while Eli sat sharpening a blade. Clara fussed, and Martha carried her over. Without asking, Eli reached out, arms surprisingly gentle as he took the child. She quieted instantly, tiny fingers curling into his shirt. His expression shifted, a mixture of wonder and fear. Abijah trusts you, Martha said quietly. Eli shook his head. She doesn't know what I've done. You've fed her, carried her, chosen her when no one else would. That is what she knows. For the first time since he'd crossed her threshold, Eli's eyes glistened. He turned his face away, ashamed of the tears he could not stop. She makes me wish I were better than I am, he whispered. Martha's voice softened. Perhaps that's the point of children. They draw us toward the man we ought to be. Their eyes met across the firelight. Something passed between them, fragile, tentative, but undeniable. Not love yet, not even trust, but the first spark of belonging. The spark was tested sooner than they wished. That night, hoofbeats thundered through the snow outside. Eli stiffened, clutching Clara instinctively close. Martha snatched the lantern. Thomas burst through the door with rifle in hand, and together they peered into the dark. A voice called from the ridge. Rider, we know you're there. Shadows moved against the snow, 5 riders, rifles glinting under the moon. The posse had come. Eli's jaw tightened. They'll not quit till they've dragged me back in irons. Martha's hand gripped his sleeve. Then we'll not let them. Her words hung in the frozen air, a vow far stronger than she realized. Inside that small cabin, outlaw and widow, rancher and babe, stood bound by something greater than fear. And the storm they faced would demand more than survival, it would demand sacrifice. The riders came back with fire in their eyes. Snow muffled their hooves, but the way they sat in their saddles told the truth. This was no neighborly call. 5 of them, faces half hidden under wide brims, rifles slung loose across their thighs. At their head rode Sheriff Calhoun, the man whose badge glinted like it was minted from spite. He reined up hard outside the cabin, snow spraying. Martha, Keene, he called, voice cutting through the cold. Bring Ryder out. The law won't ask twice. Inside, Clara stirred at the noise, her soft cry shattering the silence. Eli's arms tightened around her. He looked like a man chained to the floor, every instinct screaming to run, but tethered by the fragile life pressed against his chest. Martha stood firm, lantern in hand. This is a widow's cabin, Sheriff. You'll not dictate who crosses its threshold. Calhoun's smirk spread slowly. You'd risk your good name for a man branded a thief? Or maybe it ain't your name you're protecting. Maybe it's your bed." The insult burned hotter than the fire. Thomas, standing tall by the hearth with his rifle, took a step forward. "Careful where your tongue runs, Sheriff. My stock's just up the ridge, and it's known to kick when provoked." A ripple of laughter came from the posse, but Calhoun didn't flinch. He lifted a hand, signaling silence. "Ryder doesn't belong here. He belongs in irons. We'll search the cabin if we must." The air grew brittle as glass. Martha's voice cut sharply. "You'll not set foot past my door without cause, and gossip is not the cause." Thomas chambered around. The sound echoed like thunder. "You try to cross, and you'll find I guard more than cattle." The posse shifted in their saddles. One man spat into the snow. Another muttered, "Ain't worth dying for a thief." But Calhoun's eyes gleamed. "Then maybe the widow ought to decide whose side she stands on, law or outlaw." Martha's heart pounded, but her voice did not waver. "I stand with the child, and with any man who chooses her over his own freedom." Her words landed heavily. Eli's breath caught, his face raw with something between gratitude and despair. For once, he had no answer. The standoff held until the wind shifted, carrying the sound of hooves from farther down the valley. Other riders, townsfolk maybe, drawn by the scent of blood. Calhoun saw the odds tilting and tipped his hat with a cold smile. "Enjoy your supper, widow. Tomorrow won't come so kind." He wheeled his horse, and the posse followed, shadows melting into the storm. Inside, silence crushed them. Eli lowered himself onto the stool. Clara still cradled close, his face pale as ash. "They'll be back," he said hoarsely. "With rope, if not with rifles." Thomas leaned his rifle against the wall. "Then we plan. The cabin won't hold if they come in numbers. You've got choices, Ryder. Stand, run, or surrender." Eli shook his head, bitter. "Running's all I've ever done. And surrender means hanging, standing. Well, that drags you both down with me." Martha crossed the room and laid a hand on his arm. "No, Eli. Standing means proving the truth, whatever it costs." He looked at her, eyes hollow but searching. "And if the cost is you?" Martha didn't flinch. "Then let it be. Because this child deserves more than lies and shadows." Clara stirred in his arms, cooing softly. Eli bent his head, pressing his cheek against her tiny hand. The outlaw who once rode with nothing but dust and hunger now held the only tether to redemption he'd ever known. And for the first time he wondered if he could bear the weight of staying. Night fell heavy, and with it came the fever. Clara's tiny body burned in Martha's arms, heat radiating through the quilt as if the fire itself had slipped beneath her skin. Her cries, weak and thready, cut sharper than any gunshot. Martha rocked her, whispered hymns, and dabbed her brow with cool water, but the fever climbed relentlessly as a prairie fire. Eli hovered close, pale and shaken. Every whimper from the child seemed to hollow him further. "She's burning up," he whispered. "She won't last till morning." Martha's voice was grim. "She needs a midwife, someone who knows infants. And the nearest is in town. The word struck like a blade. Town meant eyes. The town meant the sheriff's men waiting with irons. Eli staggered back, shaking his head. "If I ride in, I don't come back." "Then you'd leave her to die?" Martha's words cracked, raw with fear. "After all you've carried her through?" His eyes shut tight, face contorted with torment. He had outrun posses, storms, and death itself, but he could not outrun the truth in her voice. Thomas stepped, in jaw set. "I'll go. My name still counts for something in that town." But Eli's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "They'll follow you back, and she'll be no safer. I know their kind. They're waiting for me, not you." The cabin seemed to shrink, the firelight flickering against three souls locked in. A single terrible choice. Clara whimpered again. weaker now. Eli bent over her, pressing his lips to her damp forehead. "She chose me once," he whispered hoarsely. "Guess I don't get to quit on her now." Before dawn, he saddled the mare. Snow still lay thick, crusted hard, the wind sharp as knives. Martha pressed Clara's small blanket into his hands. "Ride fast," she said, voice trembling. "And come back, for her sake." For a heartbeat, their eyes met. No promises, no declarations, just the weight of everything unsaid. Then he swung into the saddle and kicked off into the storm. The ride was merciless. Snow stung his face, wind clawed at his coat, and hooves sank deep into drifts that swallowed sound. Eli's body screamed for rest, but the thought of Clara's fever burned hotter than the frost. Every mile echoed her cry. Every gust of wind carried Martha's gaze, steady and unyielding. He reached the edge of town by mid-morning, slipping through alleys like a ghost. But the law had not gone blind. A deputy spotted him near the livery and shouted. Voices rose, boots thundered. Eli didn't slow. He crashed into the midwife's door, gasping, "Baby, fever, hurry!" The woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wasted no time. She bundled herbs, cloths, and vials into her satchel. "You're lucky you found me," she said briskly. "Lucky the storm hasn't buried us both." Shouts grew louder outside. Eli glanced toward the window, every muscle braced. "Ain't luck. It's mercy. Now move." They fled through the back alley, boots crunching snow, the storm swallowing. Their tracks. Rifle fire cracked behind them, bullets whining into the dark. The mare lunged forward, carrying them out of town and back into the teeth of the wind. By the time they reached the cabin, Eli was half frozen, his coat torn, his cheek bloodied from a near fall. But the midwife went straight to Clara, setting her tools with practiced speed. "Boil water," she ordered. "Keep the room warm, but not stifling." Martha obeyed, hands trembling as she worked. Thomas stood guard at the door, rifle ready, eyes on the ridge. Eli sank to the floor, every bone screaming, every breath ragged. Yet when Clara's cry lifted, thin but stronger, he surged forward, desperate. The midwife nodded curtly. "She'll live if watched closely, brave fool of a man riding in weather like this. But sometimes a fool is what saves a child." Eli bowed his head, tears cutting tracks through the frost on his face. For once, he didn't hide them. Martha knelt beside him, laying a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did what a father does," she whispered. His breath caught. "Father." The word struck deeper than the cold, deeper than the bullets. For the first time, Eli Ryder felt the weight of belonging press heavier than the weight of flight. But even as Clara's fever eased, the storm outside carried more than snow. Riders were gathering again. The law had seen him, and next time they would not come with warnings. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a stage, and the final act was closing. The storm broke, but trouble rode harder than the wind. By the second evening, the ridge was alive with hoofbeats. Torches bobbed in the dark, firelight snaking down the trail like a living serpent. Sheriff Calhoun had returned, and this time he did not ride with 5, he rode with 10. The knock on Martha's door rattled the hinges. She stood firm, Clara bundled tight against her chest. Thomas stood beside her with his rifle, jaw clenched. Eli lingered near the hearth, every muscle pulled taut as a bowstring. Calhoun's voice cut through the night. "Ryder, you had your chance to run. Now you'll come quiet, or we'll drag you out." Martha stepped forward, chin high. "This is my home. You'll not tear it apart for your spectacle." The sheriff laughed, ugly and sharp. "Home? You'd make your hearth a den for thieves? That's the story you want written?" Before Martha could answer, Thomas swung the door wide, rifle leveled. "This story ain't yours to write, Sheriff." The posse shifted uneasily, guns raised but uncertain. The sight of the widow and rancher standing shoulder to shoulder had not been in their script. Calhoun sneered. You'd stake your name on him? Then you'll fall with him. Eli stepped into the doorway at last. The fire cast his face in stark relief, hollowed by exhaustion, but eyes blazing with something that had not been there before. "I'm done running," he said, voice steady. "You want me, Sheriff? Here I am, but you'll hear the truth before you hang me." Calhoun's smirk faltered. "Truth's already written, boy. Stock stolen, ranch ruined, witnesses sworn." Thomas moved closer, his voice low and cutting. "Witnesses bought, more like. And I reckon that foreman of yours kept more than tally. Marks in his book." The words landed heavily. For weeks, talk of missing cattle had swirled, but no one had spoken it plain. The crowd behind Calhoun shifted, murmurs breaking through the night. Eli reached into his coat and drew out a leather-bound ledger, edges cracked with age. Martha's heart jolted. He had carried it all along, tucked close as lifeblood. "This is the brand book," Eli said, holding it high. "Every steer, every mark, written in my own hand. Proof I worked honestly. Proof the numbers didn't add, no matter how the foreman swore it." A hush fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. Calhoun's jaw tightened. "Words on a page don't change the noose." Thomas barked a laugh. "Maybe not, but it changes whose neck ought to be in it." The posse murmured louder now, doubt slipping like water through stone. One man lowered his rifle, another shifted his gaze, no longer so sure of the sheriff, who paid his coin. Calhoun's fury boiled over. He spurred his horse forward, hand flying for the revolver at his hip, but Thomas was faster, rifle raised and cocked. "Don't," Thomas said coldly. "Not with a child in this house." The weight of the moment hung razor sharp. Calhoun's hand froze, trembling with rage. Slowly he pulled back, spitting into the snow. "This ain't finished," he snarled. "Law'll ride higher than one rancher and a widow." Eli's voice rang clear. "Then let the law ride, but I'll not bow to lies anymore." The sheriff wheeled his horse, fury blazing, and the posse followed, but not all with equal fire. Some rode slower, glancing back at the cabin where a widow, a rancher, and a branded man stood together against the storm. Inside, the air trembled with relief and exhaustion. Martha sagged against the door, Clara warm against her chest. Thomas lowered his rifle with a long breath. Eli leaned against the wall, brand book still clutched in his hand. For the first time since stepping across her threshold, his eyes no longer held only flight. They held fight, and something that looked dangerously like hope. "Storm's not done," he murmured. "But maybe the truth has found a voice." Martha's gaze met his. In that look lay more than words: gratitude, defiance, and the fragile seed of belonging that no posse could take away. Morning came with a stillness too fragile to breathe. The torches on the ridge were gone, leaving only the long scars of hooves pressed deep into snow. Inside the cabin, fire crackled low, and Clara's tiny breaths rose steady at last. The fever had broken. Her skin was cool now, her cries stronger, and when her little hand curled around Eli's finger, it no longer felt like desperation. It felt like trust. Martha knelt beside them, exhaustion etched into her face, but a faint smile tugging at her lips. "She'll live," she whispered. "By God's mercy. She'll live." Eli bowed his head, tears falling freely. He had carried her through storms, through the teeth of the law, and somehow, against every curse the world threw at him, she still breathed. For the first time he let himself believe that maybe he deserved to breathe too. By afternoon, Thomas rode into town, brand book in hand. When he returned, his eyes carried the weight of news heavy as iron. "Word spread," he said. "Calhoun's men aren't as loyal as his purse. Half the town saw the ledger. Folks are asking who really filled their pockets while crying. Thief." Eli's throat worked, voice hoarse. "So it ain't finished," Thomas shook his head. "It's turning. Won't be long before Calhoun's the one cornered." Martha exhaled, relief mingling with caution. "And you?" she asked, Eli softly. "What will you do, now the trail's not hunting you?" Eli looked at Clara, her tiny face softened in sleep. Then at Martha, who had opened her door and heart when she had no reason to. Finally, at Thomas, who had stood rifle-strong when the Outlaw pressed hardest. His answer came slowly, as though pulled from the depths of a man who had never before dared dream of belonging. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." The days that followed stitched themselves like quilt patches, quiet chores, shared meals, and laughter breaking through where silence had lived too long. Eli mended fences not just of wood, but of trust. Martha showed him where the soil turned, best for spring planting. Clara's laughter rang brighter with each passing dawn, binding them all with an invisible thread. It was not the life of a fugitive, it was the life of a family. One evening, as the last light bled red across the prairie, Martha stepped outside with Clara in her arms. Eli stood near the fence line, hat in hand, watching the sky. "You could leave tomorrow," Martha said gently. "No one would stop you," he turned, eyes meeting hers, raw with quiet resolve. "I've run all my life, but she deserves a father. And you." His voice faltered, but he finished, steady now. "You deserve a man who won't vanish with the first storm." Her heart trembled, but she reached for his hand. "Then stay, and let this be home." Thomas, leaning in the doorway, gave a rare smile. "Every homestead needs a start. Looks like this one found it. They called him Outlaw, branded him thief, chased him across snow and storm. But sometimes, a man's truth is written not in ledgers or law, but in the lives he saves." Eli Ryder laid down his guns, and in their place found a family. The widow who opened her door, the rancher who stood by him, and the child who bound them, all together. This story became part of the frontier's living legend, proof that even in the hardest country, mercy could still take root. If this tale struck your heart, ride with us again. Share it, remember it, and let its lesson carry on. For every storm breaks, but love, chosen and fought for, endures.